Now, as the encryption begins to take form across data and information over unsecured channels, so let's just say it's going across the internet or any channel in itself, we want to ensure that that channel is always going to maintain its privacy, confidentiality, and obviously the integrity behind it. So we want to make sure that any users that are exchanging data and information, we continue to have that integrity and obviously the confidentiality plus the privacy associated with that data and information. So let's just talk a little bit about the difference between private and public keys. So we'll start off firstly, we'll discuss a bit of the private key concepts. So with private keys, we know that we use a single key to encrypt and decrypt the data. Now, there are a couple of different forms and methods that are available to us when we use private key encryption. One of them is what we call our cipher stream. So cipher stream is all about encrypting our actual binary bits. So let's just say we've got a bit of binary here, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64, 128, and I'm running out of space there, 256, there we go. So if I just tidy that up a little bit. So this is our binary bit here. So with cipher streams, what they will go away and do is they will encrypt, I'll just change color here, they will go away and actually encrypt bit by bit across our binary form, right? So that's what ciphertexts are. And a very common one to do this is our reverse cipher or reverse ciphering. And this is our RC4, which is a deprecated protocol. It's not widely used as much anymore. Obviously, you still may see it in some corporate environments. However, it's out of date and there's a bit of security risks associated with it. So it's a little bit deprecated. So basically, with our cipher stream, every bit of data is encrypted. As we think of the binary forms, all those bits are encrypted throughout that process. So any different output of the binary form basically depends on that algorithm that's being used. In this case, if we're using RC4, it will have an RC4 output. The other form of our bit of methodology or the actual methods available to us for private keys is cipher blocks. Now, cipher blocks, instead of using that bit by bit encryption, cipher blocks will go away and do this in chunks. So let's just say there's a chunk of 64-bit traffic or data, and then we've got our 128-bit chunk, and then our 256-bit chunk. Well, it'll go away and it'll encrypt chunks of that data. Now, should data be, not coming out to the 128-bit, it'll go away and it'll actually pad the data to ensure it fits that 128-bit time. So different parts of the data should be encrypted. If it doesn't add up to 128-bit, for example, the data will be padded to reach that 128-bit size, and later it will be available to us via the 128-bit block system. So if we're using 128-bit block encryption, then that's how it becomes available to us. Now, with cipher blocks, there are a couple of challenges that sort of present themselves. One would be it's typically more secure, so it's more tamper-proof. Number two is it's a bit more complex than our bit-by-bit ciphering, so I'm going to say more complex. Number three, sometimes the other challenge with our private key here, when we're talking about block ciphering, there's errors sometimes in the actual block. So if those blocks are sometimes incomplete, so if we're talking about our 128-bit block, if the traffic or the data is incomplete or there's errors along those chunks, sometimes it may throw out errors when obviously decrypting that data or that information. So sometimes it can be quite challenging if it doesn't fit into that 128-bit size. So um, the other thing to be mindful as well as we talk about our block ciphers is some common ones that exist. So I'm going to say here as well, because there's also another point that I want to mention that sometimes with our block ciphers, it also takes more time. So it takes more time to encrypt and decrypt the data. Okay, and decrypt. Now, there's a couple of different protocols that are available to us. We've got our advanced encryption standard, which is available to us, and that can happen over 128-bit, obviously 256-bit chunk blocks. We've got our reverse ciphering 5, so RC5 specifically. And then we've got the lucky last one is our triple data encryption standard, which is triple DES. And these are all common protocols that use block ciphers to go away and perform their actual encryption and decryption. So as much as this looks great to us, the simplicity of using single private keys or one private key, it's sometimes challenging or less secure than it should be. So we want to ensure that if that private key has been lost or stolen, or there's some sort of malicious intent with our private keys, well, then sometimes that'll cause obviously some issues in our environment. So as much as we think that it'll be safe, anyone else that has access to that private key can then go away and decrypt our data. So sometimes something to be really, really mindful. And then we'll just jump into and talk about private keys, public keys as well. So just before we do that, I also have this diagram here that I want to sort of walk through what that private key process looks like. So just something for us to be familiar with. So anytime we talk about private key encryption, there's a single key that's used to basically encrypt and decrypt the data, right? So here we have our unsecured channel. So this is, let's just say this is the internet, right? And as that data traverses out between these two users who are sharing the data. So let's just say here that Lily wants to send a message to Mary, right? A typical email message, or maybe we're doing some sort of data that's going back and forth between these two users. So basically how this would sort of play out was, well, firstly, there's going to be the message, the initial message, right? So we're going to have obviously the clear text message that's going to happen. So she's going to go away into a browser, open up her email, and then begin writing her email. Then we're going to go through an encryption standard of such. So once Lily, in this case, uses a private key to encrypt the message goes into the encrypted state. So then obviously goes into encryption state. And then from there, it begins its transit in obviously preventing those attacks. So as it gets transmitted across the internet, that's how it provides its confidentiality, so the data doesn't get compromised. And then once it's moved into the other side, so when Mary begins to receive that, she'll go away, she'll decrypt the information, she'll use obviously she'll be using the private key in this case. So she'll be using Lily's private key, right? Lily's private key in this case, to then obviously look at the data, decrypt the data, and then she can go away and actually see the contents of that clear message. So now some challenges with this. Well, one is our private key, right? So now that we've got a private key, well, it begins to become a little bit problematic because, well, we don't want to just share our private keys with anyone, right? So we may have a single trust here. In this case, with the private key being that challenge, well, how are we going to get or move that private key to the other party who needs to use it? So getting that private key across to them can be quite challenging. We can obviously use an out of bounds or out of band access to send it to them. Obviously we can use email to send to them. We can maybe SMS or send the details across to them or over maybe a secure channel to access the information, right, or to access our private key. So sometimes that can be quite challenging on how we're going to use and utilize our private key in these instances. So once the key has been shared, though, each message from that point on, as they send and receive the data, each of them will be able to read the information securely. So that's kind of how private keys operate. Now, when we talk about our public keys, these are a lot more common in organizations today, right? So people prefer, and organizations prefer to use public keys to obviously exchange the data and exchange the information. So as we use public keys, there's still two keys that form. So we've got our private key, right, which we keep confidential, and then we've got our public key, which we can share with anyone and basically share it with anyone that we want to. These two keys obviously have a mathematical relationship and they're generated in pair-like form. So anytime we go away and generate these keys, in the event of using our public key encryption, firstly, the first thing that we need to do is generate the two keys. So we go away and we basically, one, generate our two keys, right? And our two keys are going to be our public and private key. I'm just going to say private and public. And obviously our private key is kept securely by the receiver, and our public key can obviously be shared in the public domain. Now, typically what we'll also have here, we'll have our public key server, which we can then go away and publish our public key. And then what would happen is once the public key is shared, then who has access to the public key, they can go away and encrypt the messages and basically send the data across one another. So the public key in this case will be sent to anyone or sent to people on the other end. Let's say in this example, Mary. Mary will go there, she'll review the public key server of Lily's public key, and that's how they'll go away and do that transaction or do that, share the information across each other. So this happens both when, obviously, when both keys were created in the relationship with that public key pair, and therefore we don't need to share the private keys. All we need to worry about is accessing that public key. So typically what would happen in this case, the same sort of message or the process will kind of apply. We've got our clear message that we begin to write up. So Lily will go away, she'll write up her email of such, she will encrypt that message with her private key. Now, as the data traverses across the internet here, when Mary needs to go receive that message, she'll go into the public key server, she'll look at Lily's public key, which gets published, and then she can go away and decrypt the data using Lily's public key, right? So we don't touch her private key. Private keys remain private and confidential in its entire state. So that's a little bit about the two different challenges when we're talking about private and public keys. I hope you've enjoyed this video, as always, see you all in the next video.